Could you forgive your mother's murderer? We're in a two-part series on forgiveness on the Love First podcast. Our special guest returning from last week is Dr. Everett Worthington, Jr., Professor Emeritus at Virginia Commonwealth University. His work in the psychology of forgiveness is known worldwide. The author of 30 books and more than 350 scholarly articles, he is even presently conducting studies on forgiveness around the world. If this is your first time on the Love First podcast, thank you for joining us. We would invite you to like, subscribe, and share. And if you are returning, then you already know the blessing that Dr. Worthington will be this evening as we continue our conversation around how do we forgive ourselves and others.
Love first, I know. Love first, I know. Lord, take control. Lord, take control. Love first in my soul. Love first in my soul. Lord, take control.
We want to thank you again for joining us, and we are so happy to have Dr. Everett Worthington back with us to continue our discussion of forgiveness. So, Ev, thank you so much for joining us last week and for getting us started in this very important exploration of forgiveness. Thank you. And some things you mentioned last week, you talked to us a little bit about the ideas of forgiveness, two types, decisional forgiveness and emotional forgiveness. And as you laid that out for us, you were helping us understand how those function in relationship to the injustice gap. And then you closed us out with this kind of reach forgiveness, these 5 steps to help us work toward forgiveness. And the more we work at it, the better we could imagine ourselves growing toward being forgiving people. But then this episode, we're going to take a turn. Our hope is to explore how we forgive others and how we forgive ourselves. And so let's begin this discussion with this question. How is the forgiveness of someone else and the forgiveness of ourselves similar and different?
Well, I think I think they're similar in that once we start working on forgiveness, the processes of making a decision to forgive myself is the same process as making a decision to forgive somebody else. And the process of working through steps to experience an emotional forgiveness are the same steps that we would work through in forgiving ourselves. So the differences come about because we're really, we almost approach the two ideas with a different framework. So forgiving ourselves, we experience much more as a perpetrator than we do as a victim. So, when I struggle with forgiving myself, I'm really more struggling with my own self-condemnation for doing something wrong or being something that's less than I think I could be.
Yes.
That's much more, it's much more similar to divine forgiveness, where I come to God as, someone who doesn't deserve forgiveness, but relying on mercy. So, but forgiving, other people, I come at it much more under the psychological experience of being more a victim of having been hurt or having been offended or wronged in some way. So I think the whole way that we approach the issue is really quite different.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I was thinking a lot about self-forgiveness back in 2005 because my brother had committed suicide right before the time where I was spending about 4 months in at the University of Cambridge as a visiting scholar.
Mm.
And right before I arrived at Cambridge, he had committed suicide, and the reason was he had discovered my mother's body. She had been murdered about 10 years before that, and he never could get the pictures out of his mind. And so, he was really struggling with a post-traumatic stress problem. And, he finally said something to me about that. And I said, Mike, I think you need to get some counseling to deal with this PTSD. And he didn't have a very high opinion of counselors. And so he said, well, I'm not going to any shrink. This is what he says to his shrink brother, right? So this tells you something. And so I persisted, and I said, well, Mike, if you haven't gotten over this in 10 years, you're probably not going to get over it in another 3 months or 6 months unless you do something different. And he said, well, I'm not going to any blankety blank shrink, and I don't want to hear any more about it.
Yes.
And so, I understand resistance. I've been a clinical psychologist for 40 years, more than 40 years. And, I know that you kind of back off and give the person space and come at it a different way. Did I do that? Not a chance. I responded to my brother just like a hormone crazed 18-year-old, And so when he said, I don't want to hear any more about it, I went, whatever, as you can hear the adolescent whine there.
Yes.
Anyway, that, of course, is what came back to haunt me when about 2 or 3 months later he had committed suicide, and I did not do what I knew I could do to try to help him. And so I was over there in Cambridge, and I was thinking a lot about my own self-condemnation and trying to work through how do we help people deal with this. We had already just completed, about 3 months before I left for that trip, a study on self-forgiveness in inpatient alcohol wards. And so we had done a little bit about it, but we didn't have a very sophisticated look at it. And so I was trying to think about it. And I was reading a book, and it was about the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the woman who wrote this was named Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela, and I met her at Kennedy School of Government up in Harvard about a year before that, and I really liked her presentation, liked her work, so I got her book. Well, she ended up spending 40 interviews with one of the most notorious people in the nationalist party that was the kind of the chief policeman, named Eugene de Kock.
Yeah.
And as I was reading this book, I started thinking, what if Eugene de Kock had come to me and said, I've killed 100 people myself, but I've decided to forgive myself.
Wow.
What would I say? And the answer is, I would say, no way. You cannot do that. This is not just a decision that you make to feel better about yourself. There has to be something more in self-forgiveness than there is in forgiving other people, where I can make a decision and I can work toward an emotional change. And so what I think is the more is that there has to be an element of accepting responsibility and being accountable.
Yeah.
So so the first thing that I would have to do if I were dealing with self-condemnation is go to God. I would have to say, I did wrong, Lord. I can't fix this myself. I rely on you. That's my only hope.
Yes.
And and so that's kind of a first step. But a second step is I hurt other people, you know, by not behaving as well as I could have behaved with my brother. His son and his wife felt consequences when they lost him.
Yes.
I might have been able to make less, less possible. It's not like I felt responsible for Mike's decision. He made the decision himself, but I probably could have done more and probably, you know, let down people in his life. And so, I would need to be accountable for that and responsible and to try to make some kind of social repairs.
Yes.
So I make that spiritual repair by going to God and letting
Yes.
God His mercy work. And I make a social repair by seeking to, you know, help them by, maybe there's things that can't be undone, but maybe I could pay something forward so that other people didn't have to experience this. And so I
Yes.
ended up writing a book on self-forgiveness,
Yes.
as a way of kind of paying this forward.
Yes.
And then
Yes.
the third difference is, I probably have done some damage to myself.
Hmm.
In whatever wrong I did, I may have inflicted a kind of a moral injury on myself.
Yeah.
We're seeing a lot of this as people come back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and they've seen and done things that they don't approve of, and they feel that they've inflicted this moral injury on themselves. And so that repair of the moral injury and trying to, come to a more an acceptance more of what I've done, really all of those things come before uh, kind of working through forgiving myself.
Yes.
So God, social repair, and moral repair of my own psyche.
Yes.
So that,
Something I'm hearing in this is that working through forgiveness may or may not offer us the ability to undo something or to what I'm referring to in general would be if I had a fender bender in my car, I may be able to replace that fender, repaint it, the paint matches perfectly, and apparently all is restored. But versus an injury that does permanent physical damage to someone that cannot be taken to, an auto shop and just a replacement part put on. And if I'm hearing you correctly, in regard to your brother, there are parts of that that were not your decision, and parts of that that you could not change or restore, but you did seek other ways to work through the connection with God, the social repair, and the moral repair. And I think that's important. As you mentioned, your work with people that were in inpatient alcohol treatment or a treatment for alcohol abuse. During Recovery Month, one of the things that we highlight and recognize is that as people are growing into freedom from addiction and living sober lives and seeing themselves blossom again and flourish again in so many countless ways, the clarity of mind that comes with all of that can also bring back a clearer recognition of things that we've done in the past, wrongs committed, things that have been done that have hurt family, friends, even complete strangers. And we find ourselves trying to figure out, well, now what? What do we do about that? Do we just try to stuff them somewhere in a garbage can in the back of our mind? Do we risk revisiting those sins we've committed? Do we risk all of that? And the reality is that I believe the Spirit kind of calls us to bring those things out so that we can deal with them, and that and we can find this freedom that you are referring to. I noticed that one of the resources that you do provide is self-forgiveness. That is something that you have created. And before we move on from here, I want to stop and thank you for revealing some very, very challenging components of your life for you to think through. I know you mentioned it in passing, but finding a way to navigate your mother's murder, and then looking at your brother's suicide. These are things that are very deep, shaping components of your life, and you have gifted us this evening by putting these out here so that we too can begin to look at some of the very, very traumatic components of our lives and start to trust that somehow God could help us navigate those. How do we forgive those who, in some sense or another, either believe that they have not wronged us, or at least they won't acknowledge that they have wronged us? How do we forgive someone who resists acknowledging the way that they have wounded us?
Well, last week I talked about an injustice gap, and how the larger that gap, the harder it is to deal with one way or the other. Now, I could deal with it by, turning it over to God. I could deal with it by forbearing, by seeking justice. There are many ways I could deal with it. I can mix and match those, and then mix in with forgiveness, so that, all of them kind of get the injustice gap smaller. But when a person just doesn't want to accept responsibility that they've hurt us, or they truly don't believe that they were at fault at all, that they are in fact a victim, what that does is that increases our injustice gap. So the process of forgiving that person is exactly the same as if the gap were smaller. It's just that it's going to be harder to do. It might take more work because, I feel that a wrong has been added on top of another wrong, and that makes the fence higher to get over.
Yes.
In fact, for some people, it can feel like, as they look at that wall that they have to get over, they feel like there's no way in the world I can get over that, and they give up and don't try to forgive.
Yes. Yes.
I do believe that people can, kind of knock off pieces of the wall. It's kind of like the Berlin Wall falling down, it came off chunk by chunk.
Yeah, that's right.
I may turn this over to God, and that, lowers things down a little. And I may just say, Lord, your will be done. And, if you think punishment is in order, that's up to you. And then maybe another chunk goes down. So, I can maybe get it a little lower to where I can finally get over it, or scramble over it, or climb over it, or pole vault over it, whatever it takes to get over.
So you have, you mentioned in our last episode, this study with 6 different countries, these 2 places in Ukraine, but you mentioned Colombia, Indonesia, these different places where you're doing this forgiveness work. You've also mentioned reading this book about South Africa and then the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I know that you've had more experience there. What have you learned about personal forgiveness through your interaction with like social forgiveness or societal forgiveness? When we think about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the idea of a society trying to move forward without just disintegrating, but determining that somehow we want to remain a country, we want to somehow move forward as a society, but we can't ignore what happened. So we got to figure out how to move beyond that. And they chose the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which of course did invite forgiveness. What have you discovered about the correlation or maybe a contrast about personal forgiveness and those big social attempts to try to forgive and move on, like as a society?
Well, I think probably the main learning, if there is main learning, is that forgiveness is very, very individual. And there's no formula. As much as I would like to think that the reach forgiveness formula is a formula, there's no formula. So Mike McCullough, who really got me started on studying forgiveness scientifically, Mike did just a brilliant study in which he invited people who had just been offended and hurt in some way to come into his lab and, report on the amount of unforgiveness they felt toward the person. And then he invited them to come back 19 straight days. So what he found was that most hurts are forgiven within 3 or 4 days. They're gone, but about 10 to 15% are not. And furthermore, once, on the average, once they get entrenched, they often last a long time. So it looks like, a curve that, is a particular curve. It's just really very brilliant to see this curve written out, where they fall off quickly and it levels out. The brilliant thing about that study was the next thing he did was plot individual responses. And it looked like spaghetti. It was not a smooth curve, but some people got worse instantly. Some people got worse over time. Some people it seethed and they finally took off. Some people didn't change at all in the whole 19 days. Some people coasted down. Some people fell off and forgave, right away. It was all over the place. There's no one solution to this. And there's no one solution societally. So the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission in some ways had a lot of success, although it was criticized by folks. But Rwanda, which had the massacres in 1994, they were in a very different place, and they could not just pick up the South African solution and apply it in Rwanda, because in South Africa, it was the minority of people, the whites, that were inflicting most of the wrongs on the majority, blacks. But in Rwanda, it was just the opposite. It was the majority who had attacked the minority. And so they tried to form these gacaca courts, they called them, but they're local village courts. And they invited people to, tell the truth. And basically, the people who had been victimized and, had had human rights violations, they did not want to point a finger at a majority person and say, he killed my brother, he killed my wife, whatever, because they were in the minority, and the majority could, really do violence to the person who testified. So you can see that even two
Mm.
African countries happening at around the same time, the solutions had to be vastly different. And the
Yes.
same is true with individuals. There's no one size fits all here.
Yes. Yes. And something that I'm hearing, combining our two episodes, that is incredibly helpful is that what you have advocated is more steps and consistency. Try these steps, work through these steps. Something that was so helpful to me out of last week's session was the idea that, with the emotional replacement, I might try for empathy, but if that doesn't work, then sympathy, and maybe then compassion, and maybe love. But recognizing that empathy might not be where I find that next step forward, And I think that that's very, very helpful, because in the desire to do the good work of moving from a completely negative orientation, either toward myself or toward others, and moving toward a positive and meaningful orientation toward myself and toward others, that's forgiveness's gift, is the work of that transition. And I don't want to spend the rest of my life upset with myself or upset with others. I don't want. I've joked with my friends and family that my mother's side of the family were Olympian gold medalists in grudge holding. They just had the capacity to hit the gold medal podium every time. And I know that they're not all that way. And I know that it hurt the ones who did choose a grudge over forgiveness. And I know that it did do damage to themselves and to their relationships. What do we do when we find ourselves re-traumatized by the memories of the things we've done wrong, or the things that have been done to us that were wrong? What do we do when we find ourselves trying to forgive, genuinely working the steps of forgiveness, but we're still re-traumatized by that hurt? What do we do?
Well, on one of the exercises that we have people do after they've gone through these 5 steps to reach emotional forgiveness is we send them to we ask them to write on their hand in black ink, what a kind of a, pardon this pun, but a shorthand description of the thing that they're trying to forgive. And then we send them to the bathroom to wash it off.
Mm.
And we ask them when they come back, how did you do? And about 80% of them will say, yeah, did great, washed it off. About 20% say, well, I washed most of it off. I can still see it.
Mm.
So then we're like, okay, well, how are you going to get it off? And the solution is wash it again, and sometimes time is going to just erode it off.
Yes.
And this is, if we've got hurts because somebody has harmed us, and we have, forgiven them, then the hurt may come back. And often the solution is not to try to forgive again.
Mm.
It is. Sometimes it is. But basically what happens when I experience hurt is I am conditioned to respond in anger and fear. It's just the way God made us. So, for example, if I'm cooking, breakfast for my family, and I'm, over the stove, and I'm cooking. We have this cabinet above the stove that's kind of a demon cabinet, because it can sense when I look away and it pops open, and the corner of it,
Yes.
itself, and I will raise up and hit it,
Yes.
and I respond automatically by punishing it. I slam it, I feel anger,
Yeah.
as a result of being hurt. It is
Yeah.
a natural thing to do, and it's a conditioned response, so that if somebody hurt me and I see that person or I think about that person, I may have forgiven them long ago, but that hurt and anger will come back.
Yeah.
Now, if I go, oh, I'm feeling angry, I must not have forgiven the person.
Mm.
Nope, I have forgiven them.
Yes.
And what I'm experiencing is exactly the way that God made me. It's that anger,
Yeah.
that fear that came from a prior hurt is a signal to me to be careful, because you got hurt there before and you could get hurt again.
Mm.
That's not unforgiveness. That's God, working in my life to make my body protect myself
Yeah.
from stepping out into, some kind of playing in traffic again when I
Yes.
almost got once before there.
Yes. Yes. Now, it's fascinating. The same carpenter must have built the cabinet over my sink in my house. I have a demon cabinet in my house.
Some kind of, conspiracy.
It is, and it has been similarly punished, by the way. But so maybe one of the things that it would be good for us to kind of really drive a stake in the ground here is that sometimes we think, well, if I remember the offense, I must not have forgiven the offense. And I'm hearing something different in how you're describing this, that just remembering the offense does not mean that we didn't forgive, but it might just be God's signaling system that reminds us that hurt was there. What do we do when we find ourselves kind of in that transition point where we have forgiven ourselves, but we're trying to learn to trust ourselves, or we have forgiven someone, but now we're trying to learn to trust them again? And I think a lot of people can relate to that kind of that uneasy place where, yes, I've forgiven them, but can I trust them? Yes, I've forgiven myself, but can I trust myself? How would you kind of guide us through that idea of learning to move into trust, even though we have that uneasiness of those feelings you've described?
Well, I think that, I appreciate the word trust, because I think, that there is a confusion that often happens that is between forgiveness and reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
So if I forgive someone, it's something that happens inside my body.
Mm-hmm.
It is either a decision, that's decisional forgiveness, or it's an emotional change, but it happens inside my skin.
Yes.
But trust is something that happens between two people. It's not the same thing. It's part of reconciliation. So reconciliation is restoring trust in a relationship where trust has been damaged.
Yes.
And I can forgive someone and never reconcile with them.
Yeah.
Because it's dangerous to
Yes.
be in a relationship with them, and they're going to kill me if
Yes.
they see me again. So what forgiveness does is it gives us a kind of a yearning to reconcile. But even though I may have that yearning to reconcile, I also have good judgment that says, but this person is not a safe person to reconcile with.
Yes. Yes.
Or this is not the right time to try to do that.
Yes.
I think what people often get into trouble is they confuse the two. They think, if I forgive the person, I have to get back in relationship with them.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, not really. Scripture does, Jesus does mandate for us to make a decision to forgive, I believe.
Yes.
reconciliation is never really mandated with another person.
Right.
Paul says, as much as it's up to you, live at peace with all people.
Yes.
But it isn't always up to us.
Yes.
And if the person is going to kill us, then they've made it not up to us. You're not going to reconcile.
Yes, and I deeply respect that. One of our members who's been a mentor to me talked about the ministry of reconciliation as serving the cause of reconciliation. You're serving the cause of reconciliation, but that does not mean that reconciliation will happen. But with your life, you're seeking to serve the cause of reconciliation. And he reminded me that even Jesus had Judas. And of course, obviously, Jesus did nothing wrong in his relationship with Judas. But at some point, Judas himself did not see reconciliation as something that he was willing to try with Jesus. Yet Peter did. For some reason or another, Peter did see reconciliation as something that he was willing to try. So I like the idea of serving the cause of reconciliation. And that's more of what I'm really hearing and appreciate in your analysis of South Africa and Rwanda. Your comparison is that the goal wasn't one country to mimic another country. It was for both of them to serve the cause and to hopefully open doors for that process of reconciliation. I want to come back to the spaghetti. I was intrigued by Mike McCullough's work and assessment, and I would love for our listeners to stop for a moment and imagine a big plate of spaghetti that every single strand of pasta is a person. And that rather than us imagining that 400 pieces of pasta would be laid out on the counter in perfectly straight lines, saluting the meatballs as they go, right? We're actually just talking about just this quagmire of emotion. And I think it's important for us to realize that sometimes we might be the person who forgives in the first 3 days, and sometimes we might be that person that is working at forgiving someone or forgiving ourselves for perhaps years or decades. And we should not be discouraged if we find ourselves still working toward that. I want to, yes, please.
Throw in a little anecdote. I will often say, I was really blessed by and favored by God that I was able to forgive the murderer of my mom in a very short period of time.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you did that?
I will, just as soon as I make this little point. And but that doesn't mean I'm a super forgiver, because I had a professor who gave me a B once. Can you imagine that? 10 years it took me to forgive this guy. And I did it only by a religious experience, by, being invited to remember this guy's face and remember this guy's person. And then it was Joy Dawson who was involved with YWAM in the early years. And, she said, now imagine that Jesus comes in the room, what would he do?
Oh.
And at first I thought, well, of course he would come and comfort me. And then I thought, wait a minute, I've just heaped 10 years of abuse on this guy. He probably would go comfort the guy.
Wow.
And I cannot, Joy Dawson ruined my grudge holding against this guy. I'll never forgive her for that. But
see, now you're meddling. I do have a professor that gave me a B, and I see, here you go. You are now my Joyce Dawson. You are ruining my grudge holding against this guy. But I do think that for a lot of us, just hearing you say, I forgave those that murdered my mother, We would think if you peeled back your shirt, there'd be an S on it that you're a super forgiver, yet you say you're not. And you give us this illustration that with which we can all relate to that seemingly much less offense, much smaller injustice gap that really hangs us up. But would you mind taking a few moments and walking us through forgiving in relationship to your mother's murder?
Sure. So it happened back on a New Year's Eve night, in which my mom lived alone because my dad had died 5 years before of cancer, and mom didn't drive. So there was no car in the driveway, and so she had gone to bed early on this New Year's Eve night. And so here's a darkened house with no car in the driveway, and probably teenagers, or a particular teenager at least, that these people are gone and we're going to waltz in there and steal everything of value and it'll be a perfect crime. So he even went up and pounded on the door because the people next door actually reported hearing a noise, and it didn't get repeated, so they didn't investigate. But it didn't wake my mom because she had a hearing problem and was asleep. And so he went around and broke in the back door using a crowbar, breaking the window out, and then reaching in and unlocking the door and going in and starting to search the place. Well, what happened was my mom eventually woke up with him standing in the hallway, pulling books off of the bookshelf in the hallway. And he, struck her with that crowbar repeatedly until she died. So, that night, after being called by my brother who had discovered my mother's body, I was down in Knoxville, Tennessee with my sister and my brother, and we were in Mike's back room talking about what we had learned from walking into the police investigation. And they had, by that time, narrowed it down to it looked like a burglary and probably at least one adolescent that had broken in and stolen some things and gotten interrupted. So I remember getting so angry as we talked about this that I pointed to a baseball bat against the wall and said, I wish whoever did that were here. I would take that baseball bat and I would hit him in the head until he died. And I said he would not last 30 minutes. And my brother said, if I got a hold of him, he wouldn't last 10. Yeah. And my sister said, well, I'd make him last over an hour. So we were all just really furious. So that night I went up to my aunt's house to spend the night, and I couldn't sleep. I was so angry. So I spent 4 hours kind of walking around her bedroom there, the bedroom I was staying in, and just raging. Well, by about 3 o'clock in the morning, I just sat down on the bed and thought, well, I can't continue to do this. I write a eulogy for my mom because, being the oldest child and my dad was gone, I would be speaking at the funeral. And so as I sat down to kind of think about what a life means of a woman that hadn't gotten more than 100 miles away from home, probably, except for the brief time she was in the armed forces in World War II as a nurse. And I just thought, I've I've spent a lot of time studying forgiveness. Mm-hmm. I have just allowed myself to go 24 hours and just not even think about that word.
Yes.
I blocked it out. And so I thought, well, I really should think about forgiving. And so I started to work through that reach forgiveness model that we had developed. I had worked through it many times on smaller events, but never something like that. And so I started to think about what it might be like for this young man to be out in the cold on New Year's Eve night, looking at a darkened house, thinking this is going to be a perfect crime,
Mm.
getting interrupted, thinking this old woman is spoiling my perfect crime.
Mm.
Not only that, besides anger, he's probably thinking she's looking at my face. I'm going to go to jail. He's got anger and fear, and he's holding on to that crowbar, and he has an impulse control problem, or he wouldn't be breaking into people's houses. So he reaches out and strikes her and repeatedly. As I got that far in kind of reconstructing this from an empathic point of view, um, I suddenly just kind of flashed back to earlier that night and seeing myself pointing to that baseball bat and saying, I wish whoever did that were here. I've had 24 hours to think about that, but I would take that baseball bat and hit him in the head repeatedly. It wouldn't be a spur of the moment thing. I would do it intentionally. And I couldn't help but think, so whose heart is darker?
Mm.
Is it a kid who reacts to fear of going to jail, of anger, who has no time to think about this, who has an impulse control problem? Or is it me, this forgiveness researcher,
Mm.
Christian, mature adult at that time, who, is willing to contemplate hitting somebody in the head intentionally until they die? I thought my heart's darker than his.
Ah.
I knew if I confessed that I could be forgiven. And
Mm.
I thought, well, if I can be forgiven for the darkness of my heart, who am I to hold that against this young man? And so I was able to forgive the young man, not knowing who it was. It's all at that point about just imagining what it must have been like. But
Yeah.
I was able to forgive the young man.
Yes. I want to thank you for that. And I know our listeners will want to sit in this for a moment and kind of contemplate and ruminate on what you have shared. And this causes us to not only, edge into your experience as you're helping walk us through it, but edge into our own experiences where we have found ourselves right there at the gateway to empathy, or at least sympathy, and found ourselves, wrestling with that reality. Part of what you've drawn me to in my mind is where the Apostle Paul is giving his defense in the later chapters of the book of Acts, and the defense for why he believes what he believes. And at one point, he says to a mob that, had the soldiers not intervened, would have killed him. He says to them, I too was like you. I see you in me, and I see me in you. And that strikes me so deeply that the Apostle Paul, there just narrowly escaping death from this mob, can look at them and say, you all do realize that I've been where you are, and we succeeded. We did kill the person. We did kill these people. And he gives, as you know, he gives that testimony repeatedly at the close of the book of Acts. And I'm struck by his willingness to keep recounting those truths that would, in some sense or another, pave the way for him for some kind of an empathic response. The other thing I would like to note, and I did not know your story, and you can testify that I did not know that part of your story, but what you just modeled for us was self-directed learning and forgiveness. And that's something that you have prepared for us. So as we close out, would you tell us a little bit about the resources that are available for our listeners for self-directed growth and forgiveness?
So we are, kind of my philosophy all along has been to give psychology away. So the studies that we've done, the resources we've developed to help people clinically, whether it's couples or parents or adults in a group, we've tried to make them completely free and available to anyone who can use them.
Yes.
So I have a website, www.evworthington-forgiveness, EVWORTHINGTON-forgiveness.com. And there are all kinds of workbooks and resources for leading groups, participating in groups. For example, there is a do-it-yourself workbook for forgiving yourself.
Yes.
In a Christian context, there's a do-it-yourself workbook for forgiving others.
Yes.
There's a do-it-yourself workbook for building humility, for building patience, for a more positive life. So we've just tried to make all of those resources available. And what we've been doing, and I've been very excited about, is we've been trying to help communities forgive, and not just individuals, but whole communities. So this study that we're doing in 6 different sites in 5 countries, South Africa, Indonesia, Colombia, Ukraine, and China, there are 2 parts to that. One is that people work through one of those do-it-yourself workbooks on forgiveness. But the other part is to try to help the community, the whole community, forgive.
Yes.
We have done this in Christian universities, even in secular universities, in churches, big churches, small churches. We did it at our little church of about 100 adults. And, and so, forgiveness is all about how much time you spend to forgive. So that means the key to forgiveness is not a 30-minute sermon that will have virtually no impact on the whole group, although 1 or 2 people may think it's the greatest sermon they ever heard.
Right.
But if I use that sermon to try to direct people to fill out a workbook to forgive, to, read a book on forgiveness and try to apply it to their lives, to engage in a psychoeducational group or a study group or a book group, any kind of group where they spend time trying to forgive. This is what ends up changing individuals' lives. And if you're doing it in concert and you're being the body of Christ and you're attached to the other people and you're encouraging the other people, this strengthens the whole body beyond just adding the individuals together, because everybody's working more toward a common goal.
Yes.
This is really what's on my heart right now. And, is how do we change the world by forgiving?
Yes. Wow. Yeah, that's I heard someone say, if your goal can be accomplished in 10 years, you're working on too small of a problem, right? And yet, yeah, that's right. But this is a profound step because it's the truth of Jesus. It was Jesus's goal. Jesus came with that fundamental belief that what happened on the east end of the Mediterranean Sea 2,000 years ago with the son of a carpenter is the pivot point of history that can change everything. And it's exciting that we can join God on that mission. I just have to say, thank you for your generosity. The time you have spent with us is profound, and your transparency and your willingness to share and your willingness to make these resources available. These resources, we will put that website in the chat section. And we will also have those available on our website as well. We will direct you. If you go to lovefirst.org, you'll see resources there, and that'll take you right to Dr. Worthington's site, where you will be able to access those resources. I want to say again, Ev, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for generously giving us this time. And we certainly look forward to more conversations in the future.
Well, great. This was great for me. I really enjoyed being with you and being with the people who are watching this. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much.
Love first, I